An arms watchdog has urged major weapons exporters to cut sales to Saudi Arabia over the kingdom's deadly war on Yemen. Now, according to the New York-based campaign group known as Control for Arms Coalition, the CAC, in the United States, France, and Britain are continuing to export large quantities of lethal weapons, including explosives and bombs, to Saudi Arabia, which are being used against civilians in Yemen. The director of the group, Macdonald, says that the three arms exporters are hypocritical given their violations of the Arms Trade Treaty. The treaty, signed in 2014, bans world countries from selling arms to states or groups that could use them against civilians. Meanwhile, a member of a senior congressmen have criticized the White House over its support for the Saudi war in Yemen. The lawmakers say the onslaught against the Yemenis is largely seen as a U.S. campaign and not one unleashed by Riyadh. Joining us now via Skype from Bristol is Tony Gosling. He's an investigative journalist. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Gosling. Now, first of all, I'd like to get your opinion on this statement by the Control Arms Coalition, where they've called U.S., France, and Britain hypocritical in their arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
Well, that last comment you read out there is actually what this is now becoming. They're not fooling anyone. This is Britain, America, and Israel's war against Yemen. And in fact, some wouldn't call it a war. It's probably not. It's not a war. It's a civilian slaughter that's going on. The comments are really being echoed by many ordinary people who've found out about it around the world. And the reason that Americans, Britons, and many Europeans are not talking about this war is because our mainstream media in this part of the world is almost silent on this conflict, even though Yemen is the home to the traditions and culture of the Arabian Peninsula. It's really the home of the Arabs, one of the most important places where Arabs have developed over the centuries, over the millennia. And now they've decided they're going to cash in on the destruction of the Middle East's oldest civilization. So this is why I find it absolutely unbelievable that the Western powers, particularly Britain and its Tornado jets, which are being used for this civilian slaughter, there's not more outrage in this country, particularly amongst the parliamentary opposition. But there's actually quite a lot of paralysis, deliberate paralysis, going on within the British Parliament at the moment in order to stymie any kind of proper opposition to the present government.
Right now, Mr. Gosling, at the same time, we are seeing that these governments are quite mum about what is actually happening in Yemen. As far as the civilian casualties go, we've reported the attacking of a school. This is not the first time this has happened. Hospitals run by Doctors Without Borders even have been targeted. Why is it that there is this almost conspiracy of silence when it comes to the Saudi atrocities in Yemen? Is it also because countries like the U.S. are providing strategic advice in this war against Yemen?
Well, it's because there's no proper journalism, because there's no proper balance in the Western media when it comes to conflicts like this, which are absolutely, I mean, what we're talking about here, many lawyers say, we've just heard this group saying that they should cut arms sales. Some lawyers argue that the sales are already illegal under international and some domestic law here in Britain. So it's not surprising that they don't really want to talk about it. It seems to me we've got, you know, a kind of lawless impunity going on, a kind of criminal elite, and that's where we are. And I don't think that the media really wants to talk about it. That is because they have become part of the war machine, as happened during the Second World War. In many ways, much of the propaganda that was being spread around Europe at the time and other parts of the world was simply there to try and galvanize domestic populations behind one side or another in the conflict. And that's what we're starting to get now from London. Also worth mentioning that we're seeing lots of hospitals, schools, civilian areas being targeted. The targeting is mostly being done by British personnel and American personnel because the Saudis don't have access to the satellite imaging and the kinds of things that you need to do that very graphic work. So the finger is definitely pointing at London and Washington and and I think probably Tel Aviv are smiling because of the Yinon plan from the 1980s. Is what exactly they wanted is the whole Arab world to be balkanized, and that's what they're seeing. The British and Americans are doing it. I feel ashamed many times seeing this conflict in Yemen to be British, and it's really, I think, brought this country I'm speaking to you from now down in the world's estimation massively. But it's made a lot of money for some big arms firms in here, EADS, BAE Systems and others. And also one wonders what the kickbacks are for the politicians after they leave office, because that's the sort of thing we saw with Tony Blair, didn't we? JP Morgan giving him fantastic amounts of millions a year after the Iraq war. That's the way things are here in the West, and democracy is really on its knees.
And before I let you go, Mr. Gosling, when it comes to kickbacks, one also has to wonder what Saudi Arabia is gaining from all this, because as most of the analysis shows, any strategic gains that Saudi Arabia may have hoped for making by attacking Yemen haven't been achieved, so to speak. Yemen is continuing with its own political process internally without including Hadi. And also at the same time, Saudi Arabia is going through its own struggles economically and financially speaking.
What I think is going on here is very simple, and in a way it's happening to a much lesser extent in Britain, and that is a beleaguered elite that are unelected, unelectable, really. Nobody would have elected these people to run the Saudi royal family, to run the country. They are beleaguered and they're lashing out. They're afraid that someone's going to come and get them. And what they're doing is they're saying, well, look, they're desperate for the protection. So they're holding out their hand to Britain and to the United States. And they're saying, well, look, we need some help to stay in power. And of course, the British and the Americans desperately need the Saudi royal family to stay in power. And they need the same, to happen in Israel, that Israel to be under their, certainly allied, I wouldn't say under their control, but very much allied to them, because they want to control the Middle East, particularly because, of course, of the oil. But also, I think that there are deliberate attempts here to foment tension between sectarian tension and religious tension. It's an old technique that was used in the evil days of the British Empire. It's called divide and rule.
Okay, let's leave it there for now. That's Tony Gosling. He's an investigative journalist, and he's joining us via Skype from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, it's always a pleasure having you with us here on Press TV.